Derek discovered a tiny, vulnerable German Shepherd pup trembling in the bitter cold by the roadside, abandoned and alone. With compassion, he scooped up the little creature and devoted himself to restoring its health, and in doing so forged a bond that seemed unbreakable. Yet as the days and weeks passed, a nagging unease began to settle in his heart. One fateful, stormy night, the long-hidden secret was finally revealed. The animal he had been nurturing was not a dog at all. What exactly was it? And what consequences would follow once the proper authorities learned the truth? Before we embark on this full account, please share in the comments where you're watching from today, and if this tale resonates with you, be sure to subscribe. Derek's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned pale as he drove through a relentless tempest. After nearly 24 hours of nonstop emergency calls, exhaustion weighed on him, and the steady swish of his windshield wipers nearly lulled him into a trance. Rain battered his windshield like a barrage of bullets, reducing the dark road ahead to a swirl of indistinct shadows and glimmers. As he neared his home, murmuring softly about his fatigue, he eased into a familiar bend along Highway 16. Usually, the long, empty stretch of road would allow him a moment of relaxation. But tonight the furious weather demanded every bit of his concentration. As his headlights swept over the slick, rain-drenched asphalt, something unusual caught his eye, a small, dark shape lying on the shoulder of the road. Derek squinted, his instincts honed over 15 years of rescue work immediately urging him to investigate. Despite his tired state, he gently applied the brakes and steered his truck onto the roadside shoulder. For a brief moment, he sat there, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain on his truck's roof. Part of him wanted to simply drive on, thinking it might be nothing more than debris from the storm, but his gut told him otherwise. Trusting his years of experience, he reached for his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped into the downpour. The rain soaked him instantly, but he hardly noticed as he approached the mysterious shape. With the beam of his flashlight cutting through the inky darkness, his heart sank. There, curled into a pathetic little ball, lay a creature that looked far too emaciated and drenched to be a normal puppy. It resembled more a soaked rodent than a young dog. As Derek knelt down, the creature timidly lifted its head and let out the faintest, most fragile whimper he had ever heard. "Hey there, little one," he whispered tenderly, already removing his jacket. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Draping the jacket over the shivering animal, he cradled it against his chest. The small being offered no resistance, likely too weak to struggle, and soon found itself safely stowed in the back of his truck. Once inside, Derek cranked up the heat. He could feel the rapid beating of the creature's heart through his palm as he held it close, his free hand firmly guiding the truck. "You're going to be all right," he murmured, glancing at the bundled form in his lap. "We'll take you to the vet first thing in the morning. The clinic opens at 8. I know that because my buddy Jamal always grumbles about the early rush at home." Without further ado, Derek carried the little animal straight into his bathroom, fetched his softest towel, and began gently drying the fragile body. Beneath all the waterlogged fur, he could tell the creature was skeletal, a wisp of a body that tightened his throat. Though the eyes were barely open, their warm brown hue shone through. Working both quickly and carefully, Derek spread out a few old blankets near his heater in the living room, crafting a snug nest for his newfound friend. He laid the animal right in the center, and almost immediately it curled up into a tight ball, shivering ever so slightly despite being dry. Sinking onto his couch, Derek couldn't tear his gaze away from the small form. Who had left it there? Was a family frantically searching for this missing pet in the storm? He promised himself to check local notices in the morning, but for now, weariness overtook him, and his eyes fluttered closed. Just as sleep began to claim him, a peculiar sound broke through, a tiny chirruping noise coming from the makeshift bed. It was as if a little bird had begun to sing, even though dawn was still hours away. Stirred from his slumber by this unexpected sound, and with his neck stiff from an awkward nap on the couch, Derek couldn't recall why he wasn't in his own bed. Then the sound came again, accompanied by faint scratching and rustling near the heater. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a peaceful calm, punctuated only by the steady drip of water from the gutters. Rubbing his eyes, Derek sat up and peered toward the improvised nest. The little creature was now awake, its small body moving in curious, almost feline stretches rather than typical canine motions. "Hey there," he softly greeted, careful not to startle it. Slowly, he made his way into the kitchen and returned with a small bowl of water and a few shredded pieces of turkey he'd rescued from the fridge. Setting the bowl and scraps near the blanket, he observed as the animal's nose twitched at the new scents. After a tentative sniff, however, it turned its head away. Worried, Derek muttered, "You need something in your system, buddy." Dipping a finger into the water, he gently offered it to the creature. This time, the response was immediate. The little animal lapped eagerly at his fingertip, its pale pink tongue darting out to savor every drop. In that moment, as Derek's eyes met the creature's enormous, dark, and almost unervingly aware gaze, he paused. There was something peculiar in the way it looked at him, an intensity that was both different and oddly unsettling. Sleep was now impossible. Derek retrieved his phone, settled back onto the couch with the creature watching his every move, and began searching online for advice about caring for an abandoned puppy. He typed phrases like how to care for a stray puppy, what to feed an infant canine, and signs of dehydration in young pups. One page after another offered guidance, some helpful, some contradicting, while the soft rustling of movement drew his attention once again. The little animal was trying to stand, albeit unsteadily, but with a strength that belied its previous frailty. Its limbs, unusually long and delicate, stretched out as it gave a high-pitched chirp that filled the room. Derek frowned and set the phone aside. That sound was not the familiar bark of a dog, but something reminiscent of a bird's call. When the next morning's light streamed through his living room, Derek awoke to find that the creature, whom he had already begun to care for, was up and about. Its nose twitched as it explored every nook and cranny of the room, its uncertain steps hinting at newfound energy. Amused, Derek watched as the little animal discovered a discarded pen cap and pounced on it with unexpected agility. "Feeling better, huh?" he said softly. In the kitchen, Derek cracked eggs into a sizzling pan, preparing breakfast for himself and a small portion for his tiny guest. The enticing aroma of cooking eggs immediately caught the creature's attention. Its oversized ears pivoted toward the sound, and when Derek set down a small plate of scrambled eggs on the floor, the animal cautiously approached. After a tentative sniff, instead of devouring the food on the plate, it clutched small morsels in its mouth and scampered off, attempting to hide them behind the trash bin and under the kitchen cabinets. "That's odd," Derek murmured, watching the peculiar behavior with mounting curiosity. After breakfast, the creature continued to explore the house with increasing confidence, moving from one room to the next. Derek observed that it deliberately ignored the plush pet bed he had set up by the heater and instead chose a spot beneath the couch, curling itself into a tight ball with its bushy tail wrapped protectively around its body. From this secretive hideaway, it watched Derek with bright, intelligent eyes. Noticing that the creature's reddish-brown coat was catching the early morning light, Derek smiled and said, "I think I'll call you Copper." The little animal's large ears twitched in response, but it remained quiet, still watching him from its hidden nook. After that, Derek grabbed his keys and wallet and stepped out for a quick trip to the local pet supply store, leaving Copper safely inside. There, he stocked up on essentials, premium puppy food, a few chew toys, a small blue collar, and a lightweight leash. At the checkout, the cashier examined the photos Derek showed her and commented that she had never seen a puppy quite like this before. Returning home, Derek sat cross-legged on the floor and dangled one of the new toys, a soft blue ball with a built-in squeaker, in front of Copper. The fox-like creature emerged from under the couch with cautious curiosity. Instead of chasing the ball immediately, Copper pounced on it, shaking it vigorously as if determined to break it apart. Then, to Derek's amusement, the little animal nudged the ball until it rolled under the couch, joining an ever-growing collection of hidden treasures. "You really are one strange creature," Derek said with affectionate laughter as he watched Copper's tail disappear once again beneath the couch. Later that day, beneath the blazing midday sun, Derek carefully guided Copper toward his truck. The energetic little animal squirmed in his arms like a living spring as he placed it gently on the passenger seat. No sooner had Copper settled in than it began exploring the confines of the cab, moving with surprising grace and nimbleness. "Hold still, little guy," Derek chuckled, trying to wrap a blanket around the restless companion. But Copper dodged his attempts, scampering over the center console with cat-like agility. "You're one wild soul, aren't you?" he teased. At the veterinary clinic that afternoon, the waiting room reeked of antiseptic and pet shampoo. Dr. Reyes, a kind and gentle veterinarian with warm eyes and neatly tied-back hair, welcomed them with a smile as she led them into the examination room. "Let's have a look at this little fellow," she said, lifting Copper onto the metal exam table. With practiced care, Dr. Reyes examined the creature's teeth, eyes, and limbs. "These teeth are unexpectedly sharp," she noted, "and its legs are rather long for what appears to be a typical German Shepherd mix." She glanced at Derek. "How has its behavior been? Any barking?" Derek shook his head. "Actually, it makes these odd chirping sounds, and it eats in a very unusual way. It even hides its food around the house." Dr. Reyes arched an eyebrow with interest. "Its behavior is unique. We could consider running a genetic test if you'd like." Derek merely shrugged, scratching Copper behind the ears. "It's just a mutt. Whatever it is doesn't really matter." Feeling relieved by Copper's clean bill of health, Derek headed back home. In the living room, he watched as his strange new companion settled in. Copper dashed across the floor and, in one fluid motion, scaled the back of the couch, perching like a cat on a narrow ledge. "You're a peculiar one, Copper, but you're mine now," Derek said affectionately. Copper responded with a high-pitched chirp, its bright eyes fixed on Derek as if understanding every word. That night, as Derek went to bed, he was lulled by the soft chirping coming from Copper's makeshift resting spot. When the next morning arrived, golden stripes of sunlight painted the living room floor. Derek awoke with a stiff neck from sleeping in an awkward position, but his heart warmed when he saw Copper curled up in a corner of the couch. The reddish-brown fur caught the early light as the little animal lay tightly bundled, its bushy tail neatly wrapped around its body like a small fox. Derek couldn't help but smile, suddenly aware of how empty his home had been before this unusual companion arrived. Throughout the morning, Derek introduced Copper to every corner of his home. He set up a proper feeding station in the kitchen with matching bowls for food and water, yet Copper remained fascinated by every other aspect of the house. It scampered from one corner to another, its nose twitching as it investigated every new scent. It squeezed behind the bookshelf, darted under the TV stand, and even attempted to climb the living room curtains with surprising skill. "Hey now," Derek called, catching Copper mid-climb. "Those aren't for scaling." He then tried engaging Copper with a variety of toys he had purchased at the pet store. He rolled a squeaky ball across the floor, but Copper simply watched it roll by, tilting its head in puzzlement. However, when offered a plush rabbit, Copper's demeanor completely changed. It pounced on the toy with startling precision, shaking it vigorously as though it were genuine prey. Later that day, Derek decided it was time for their first walk around the block. Attaching the leash proved to be a challenge, as Copper squirmed and twisted in clear discomfort with the restraint. Once outside, rather than trotting obediently beside Derek as most dogs do, Copper darted ahead with its nose close to the ground, moving in quick, purposeful steps more akin to tracking prey than enjoying a leisurely stroll. "What kind of dog is that?" a neighbor called out, eyeing Copper's unusual markings. "He's a rescue," Derek replied. As Copper's ears perked up at a distant sound, it was evident that it was still a mystery to everyone, including itself. By evening, as Derek began preparing dinner in his kitchen, he found that despite his best efforts to keep Copper off the counters, the little animal had claimed a spot near the microwave as its personal lookout. From there, it watched every move Derek made with intense concentration, especially whenever food was involved. "You're one odd little creature, Copper," Derek mused as Copper responded with its familiar chirp, its bright eyes fixed intently on his hands while he prepared the meal. The following morning was crisp and clear. Derek packed his duffel bag for his shift at the fire station, and as he glanced over his shoulder, Copper was watching him intently from its perch on the kitchen counter. The thought of leaving his unusual companion alone for a full day twisted Derek's stomach. "What do you say, buddy? Want to come to work with me?" he asked. Copper tilted its head, those luminous eyes locked on Derek's face for a long moment. After a brief hesitation, Derek retrieved a fresh blanket he had recently bought for Copper and headed to his truck, with the little animal trotting close behind him. At the firehouse, Derek's arrival with Copper stirred quite a commotion. Colleagues gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and amusement as they examined the small creature that was supposed to be a puppy. Jamal, Derek's best friend, crossed his arms and grinned. "Looks more like something from the woods. Are you sure you didn't rescue a baby coyote or something?" Derek rolled his eyes and replied, "He's just different." Throughout the day, Copper proved to be quite the explorer, slipping silently through the station and appearing in unexpected places. The crew often found it curled up in turnout gear or tucked away in half-open lockers. Its movements were so quiet that several times someone would jump in surprise upon turning around and finding Copper watching them intently. During lunch, Copper demonstrated its clever streak by refusing the standard dog treats offered by the crew, yet somehow managing to snatch little bits of their sandwiches when no one was looking. Derek eventually caught Copper in the act by noticing that it habitually stashed its stolen treasures behind the break room couch. The real challenge, however, came when Sparky, the station's beloved Dalmatian, ambled over to investigate the newcomer. The moment the larger dog approached, Copper's demeanor shifted dramatically. Its fur bristled, and it emitted a low, guttural chirp that froze everyone in place. Sparky halted, its tail drooping in confusion, and then slowly backed away. Derek watched the exchange with growing concern, mentally noting Copper's clear discomfort around other dogs. As night fell and the crew retired for the evening, Derek arranged a small bed next to his bunk using a soft blanket from home. He drifted off to sleep, only to be roused in the dark hours by a sudden absence. The bed was empty. In the darkness, his eyes finally caught sight of Copper's silhouette perched on the window ledge, perfectly still as it gazed out into the night. "You really are something else, aren't you?" Derek murmured into the quiet. Copper turned its head. Its eyes caught the dim light and shone like tiny moons. Then, in a soft, eerie yip, it broke the silence, a sound that resonated strangely throughout the silent firehouse. Morning at the fire station brought with it the familiar sounds of coffee brewing, radios chattering with static, and boots tapping steadily on the concrete as firefighters prepared for the day ahead. Derek yawned and stretched as he emerged from the bunk room, but soon realized that Copper was nowhere to be found in its usual spots. "Has anyone seen Copper?" he called out, trying to mask the worry in his voice. When no one responded, his heart began to race. He searched behind the couch, in the break room, under beds, and even in the locker room. After 15 increasingly anxious minutes, he finally spotted a flash of reddish-brown fur inside the engine bay, tucked away among old shop rags, with its little nose buried under its tail. "There you are," Derek sighed in relief, laughing. "You had me worried, buddy," one of his colleagues muttered. "Never seen a dog hide like that before." Back at home, Derek started noticing more peculiar habits in Copper's behavior. The food bowl he'd purchased remained untouched, while stray pieces of kibble were mysteriously found in odd spots, behind the couch, wrapped in blankets, or even stuffed between couch cushions. During the day, Copper would seek out the darkest corners to sleep in, but as soon as dusk fell, it became animated, darting around the house with surprising vigor. Its alertness was almost hypersensitive. Every subtle noise, from the hum of the refrigerator to distant bird calls, made its ears twitch and swivel like tiny radar dishes. One evening, as Jamal visited and watched Copper flip from shadow to shadow with its unmistakable, quick-footed grace, he joked, "You sure didn't rescue a raccoon, did you?" Derek forced a laugh at the remark, though Jamal's comment lingered in his mind. Perhaps it was time to take Copper back to the vet for more tests. That very evening, Derek decided to try some basic training. Standing in his living room with a handful of treats, he commanded firmly, "Sit," while holding up a treat. Copper stared at him with those bright, focused eyes, but made no move to comply. "Come on, buddy, sit," Derek urged again. Copper tilted its head, then suddenly darted around the room, weaving playfully between pieces of furniture. After several failed attempts at commands like stay and come, Derek slumped onto the couch with a frustrated sigh. Just then, he felt a gentle weight beside him. Copper had hopped up and curled into a tight ball against his leg, letting out a soft, reassuring chirp as if to comfort him. Over the course of the following week, Derek began studying Coppa's behavior more intently. At first, the changes were subtle. The way its coat deepened in hue, turning a richer, more vibrant reddish tone. Its awkward puppy manner gradually giving way to a lean, graceful build that allowed its movements to FL. Almost liquidly. "You're growing up, buddy," Derek murmured one morning as he ran his hand along Coppa's back. The fur, too, had grown thicker and acquired a strangely textured quality that he couldn't quite place. Its legs now appeared more slender and agile, and when it moved, it no longer bounded with the clumsy gait of a puppy, but rather with a calculated, almost predatory grace. Derek tried to dismiss these observations as merely part of a normal growth phase, yet doubts lingered at the back of his mind. During a quiet afternoon shift at the fire station, Derek sat at a computer in the break room, scrolling through endless pages of dog breed information, photos of German Shepherds, Huskies, and various mixes. He searched for any combination that might account for Coppa's peculiar features. Its nocturnal behavior, independent streak, chirping vocalizations, and unusual feeding habits, as well as its indifference to other dogs. Just then, Jamal strolled in with a steaming mug of coffee and peered over Derek's shoulder at the screen filled with canine photos. "Still trying to figure out what kind of mutt you've got there?" Jamal teased with a chuckle. "Maybe he's actually a fox in disguise," he added. Derek laughed, but something about the remark struck a chord. After Jamal left, Derek hesitated before typing fox behavior into the search bar. As he read article after article describing nocturnal activity, food caching, chirping vocalizations known as gearing, and a general solitary nature with an aversion to other canines, each detail made him increasingly uncertain about Coppa's true identity. That night, needing to clear his head, Derek clipped a leash on a Copper and took a late-night walk through quiet streets bathed in the steady glow of streetlights. Copper padded silently beside him, its movements no longer that of an ordinary puppy. Every step was deliberate and almost stealthy. As they neared a local park, Copper suddenly tensed and tugged the leash, urging Derek toward the darker, less lit areas. With an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach, Derek tightened his grip. Copper stopped, turned its head under the artificial glow, and then emitted a chirp that seemed to linger hauntingly in the night. A sound wild, eerie, and utterly not canine. Returning home, Derek sat at his kitchen table with a warm mug of coffee, staring at his laptop screen filled with open browser tabs labeled Red Fox Behavior, Fox Pets, Fox Vocalizations, and Fox Denver. Copper had curled up on the nearby windowsill, its tail wrapped tightly around its little body in a distinctly non-dog-like manner. The soft morning light illuminated Coppa's rich, auburn fur that had developed over the past several weeks. As Derek scrolled through another article comparing fox behaviors with Coppa's quirks, his coffee grew cold. Every detail he read, the way Copper cached its food, its complete disinterest in interacting with other dogs, and that odd chirping, matched descriptions of fox behavior with an unsettling accuracy. Later that day, Derek found himself back at Dr. Reyes's veterinary clinic. The familiar antiseptic scent filled the exam room as he shifted nervously on his feet. "I know this might sound unbelievable," he began, watching Dr. Reyes as she gently examined Copper. "But is there any chance he could be part fox?" Dr. Reyes chuckled at first, but her smile faded as she scrutinized Copper more closely. Running her hands along its elongated legs and studying its sharply defined facial features, she remarked thoughtfully, "You know, his proportions are quite unusual for a typical dog. The way he moves is more reminiscent of a predator than a common pet." Adjusting her glasses, she added, "We could run a DNA test if you'd like to know for sure." Derek's stomach clenched at the suggestion. Did he really want confirmation that the possibility, once absurd, might be frighteningly real? That evening, on his back porch, Derek sat silently watching Copper, his mind racing with possibilities. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, causing Kappa's ears to swivel instantly toward the sound, its body tensing. When rustling leaves stirred in the garden, Kappa dropped into a crouch that bore no resemblance to a playful puppy pose. Derek pulled out his phone and navigated to an online pet supply store, hesitating only briefly before adding a DNA testing kit to his cart. "It's just for peace of mind," he reassured himself as he clicked to purchase. Yet as he watched Copper, a sleek form prowling along the porch railing, Derek felt a sinking certainty that he was merely confirming what he had begun to suspect. At home later, the living room was silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Derek dozed on his well-worn leather couch, one arm draped over his eyes, while Copper lay curled in a tight ball at his feet. The scene seemed idyllic, until it wasn't. Suddenly, Coppa's head jerked up, its entire body stiffened, and its ears rotated forward like radar dishes. Fixated on something beyond the window that Derek couldn't see, Copper sprang across the room in a flash of reddish fur. "Copper!" Derek called, his voice thick with sleep, but by the time he could even sit up properly, Copper had already reached the window. With its nose pressed against a narrow gap left ajar for fresh air, it squeezed through and vanished into the darkness. "No!" Derek stumbled to his feet, nearly tripping over the coffee table in his desperate rush. Grabbing his flashlight from the counter, he burst outside, his heart pounding as the beams swept over his yard. "Copper, come here!" he shouted into the quiet neighborhood. Only the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze answered. Frantically, he searched behind bushes, under porches, and in every shadow, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Yet there was no sign of the distinctive red fur or bright eyes he so desperately sought. As hours passed, Derek's calls grew hoarse and his legs ached from pacing the neighborhood. Finally, as midnight gave way to early morning, defeat weighed heavily on him. With heavy shoulders, he trudged back home, leaving the back porch light on, and collapsed into his armchair, red-rimmed eyes fixed on the door. Then, just before dawn, as the skies slowly shifted from deep black to a soft blue, he heard it, a gentle scratching at the back door. His heart leaped as he rushed to open it, and there stood Copper, its fur slightly damp with morning dew and those bright eyes locked onto Derek's face. There was something different in that gaze now, mysterious and unknowable. Silently, Copper padded inside, leaving a trail of tiny, wet paw prints along the floor. With a shaky exhale of relief, Derek closed the door behind them. Hours later, as Derek sat at his desk, he stared at an unread email with the subject DNA test results, sample number 2847. His cursor hovered uncertainly, trembling, as his hand hesitated before clicking. Copper lounged nearby in a patch of sunlight, its red coat glistening. Taking a deep breath, Derek finally opened the email. Charts and percentages filled the screen, confirming what his heart had already known. Copper was 100 Vulpes vulpes, a red fox. Not a dog, not part canine, but a true wild fox. Stunned, Derek leaned back, running his hands through his hair as the room suddenly felt far too confined. Glancing at Copper, who yawned and stretched, completely oblivious to the gravity of the revelation, Derek whispered, "You're actually a fox." The words tasted strange on his tongue, as if spoken in a foreign language. Turning back to his computer, Derek feverishly searched for information about keeping a fox as a pet. Every new tab he opened brought even grimmer news. Article after article detailed that keeping a fox was strictly illegal in his state. Heavy fines, possible jail time, and the immediate confiscation of the animal were all on the table. His throat tightened as he read accounts of previous cases where wildlife authorities had seized exotic pets, relocating them to sanctuaries or, in some tragic instances, euthanizing them if they were too domesticated to survive in the wild. A soft padding sound diverted his attention. Copper had shifted to its usual spot by the couch, curled tightly with its tail wrapped around itself, its eyes alert and familiar as they watched Derek with unyielding intensity. In that moment, everything clicked. The chirping instead of barking, the feline-like movements, the avoidance of other canines, and the nocturnal habits. All of these quirks weren't oddities at all. They were natural fox behaviors. Derek realized he had been so enamored by the idea of rescuing a helpless puppy that he'd chosen to overlook the wild nature of the creature. Copper was not a pet dog in need of saving. It was a wild animal that belonged to the forest, a fox that should be left to grow up among its own kind. Copper let out a soft, familiar chirp, the very sound that had first captured Derek's heart on that rainy night. Now, as the reality of their situation pressed down on him, Derek's heart ached at the thought of eventually having to part ways. Legally, he couldn't keep Copper. If anyone discovered the truth, the authorities would take the fox away. The mere possibility of losing Copper made Derek's stomach churn. He watched as Copper dozed peacefully, completely unaware that their lives were on the brink of a dramatic change. The next day, in the midst of a hectic break at the fire station, Derek hunched over his phone, scrolling through endless pages of exotic pet regulations. His coffee lay forgotten and cold beside him. Every few minutes, he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed his growing frustration. The laws were explicit and unyielding. No foxes were allowed as pets. Yet, Derek couldn't bear the thought of losing Copper after all they'd been through. In desperation, he dialed another number, this time reaching out to a wildlife sanctuary in the neighboring state. The conversation followed a familiar pattern. "I understand your attachment," the sanctuary director explained kindly, "but foxes simply aren't meant to be kept as pets. We have excellent facilities here." Before the director could finish, Derek ended the call. He had already contacted 6 different agencies that morning, as well as 3 legal consultants and 2 rehabilitation centers. The answer was always the same. Copper needed to be turned over. Later, as Derek finished his last call, Jamal appeared in the break room. Spinning around in his chair and crossing his arms over the backrest, Jamal teased, "You look like you're about to hurl that phone through a wall." Derek let out a heavy sigh. "I've tried everything. Nobody will help me keep him." After a moment of silence, Jamal ventured, "What about special permits? I once knew someone who kept a rescued hawk that couldn't be released back into the wild. They got permission to keep it for educational purposes." Derek's eyes brightened with a flicker of hope. "Special permits for non-releasable animals? If I can prove that Copper can't survive in the wild without waiting for further discussion." Derek began scrolling through his photo gallery, reviewing videos of Copper's odd behavior. Attempts to sleep in the dryer, stealing socks, chirping at the television. He had dozens of clips showing just how thoroughly domesticated Copper had become. "Jamal, you're a genius," he exclaimed, already drafting an email to Dr. Reyes to request a formal statement about Copper's level of domestication. For the next hour, he compiled evidence, videos of Copper's failed attempts at hunting even the slowest insects, photos of how it concealed its food, and testimonials from his fellow firefighters about Copper's unusual antics at the station. That evening, as Derek sat on his living room floor watching Copper stalk a moth that had wandered into the house, he marveled at the fox's graceful, predatory movements, a stark reminder of its wild origins. Yet when the moth finally escaped through an open window, Copper simply trotted back to Derek, curling up contentedly against his leg with a gentle chirp. Derek reached down to scratch behind Copper's ears, feeling the soft, velvety fur under his fingers, and murmured, "You belong with me." All he needed to do now was convince the authorities that his unusual companion could remain by his side. The next morning, the air was crisp as Derek led Copper along their regular walking route. The fox trotted proudly beside him, its red coat gleaming in the early sunlight. However, something felt different that day. As they passed by, a neighbor, Mrs. Lee from next door, stood watering her flowers, her usual warm smile replaced by a narrow-eyed stare fixed on Copper. Derek quickened his pace, gently tugging on the leash. A passing jogger even slowed down for a double take. "What kind of dog is that?" the jogger asked, brows furrowed. "Oh, it's just a mix," Derek mumbled, already turning back toward home. Later at the firehouse, Jamal pulled Derek aside near the equipment lockers. His normally cheerful face had turned serious. "People are talking, man," Jamal said in a low voice. "Ms. Thompson's wife was looking up fox breeds after seeing you with him last week, and Mike, the new guy, joked about calling animal control." Derek's stomach sank. and he gripped the locker's edge so tightly his knuckles went white. "If someone reports Copper before I get that special permit, they'll take him away," he muttered more to himself than to Jamal. "No questions asked." Jamal nodded grimly. "Maybe you should lay low for a while." That evening, as Derek paced his living room watching Copper near the window, the fox stood alert with its front paws on the sill, ears pricked and nose twitching in the cool night air. Derek made up his mind. No more walks, no more station visits, until that permit comes through, he declared firmly. Copper immediately sensed the change, moving from window to window with soft chirps. It even began scratching at the door, glancing back at Derek with a questioning look. Derek's heart ached as he watched the confusion in Copper's eyes. It wasn't fair to either of them, but he couldn't risk losing his friend now. When night finally fell, Derek double-checked every window and door, while Copper paced restlessly behind him, still yearning to step outside. "Just for now, buddy," Derek said softly as he locked the door and headed to bed. A few days later, Derek's truck rumbled into the vast expanse of a wildlife sanctuary. The natural habitat, dotted with enclosures, stretched out before him, and the gravel crunched under his tires as he parked. His knuckles still trembled on the steering wheel. He had left Copper at home, unable to bear the thought of bringing him into that unfamiliar setting just yet. Outside, the cool, crisp morning air was filled with the sounds of various animals. Derek followed the sanctuary signs until he reached the main office, where Natalie Brooks, a tall, weathered woman with kind yet knowing eyes, greeted him. "Welcome to Wild Haven," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you have questions about our fox rehabilitation program." Derek nodded and followed her along a winding path as she explained their process. How they assessed each animal, determined its ability to return to the wild, and provided lifelong care for those that could not. They reached a large fenced enclosure designed to mimic natural surroundings, complete with logs, brush piles, and small dens. Derek's heart sank as he observed the resident foxes darting away at the mere hint of human presence, disappearing into the undergrowth or watching warily from a distance. "These are true wild foxes," Natalie said softly. "This is their natural behavior." Derek couldn't help but think of Copper, how it had curled up on his couch, chirped for attention, and followed him from room to room, and how different it was from these wary creatures. "We provide excellent care here," Natalie continued in a gentle yet firm tone, "with ample space, proper nutrition, and veterinary oversight. But there's no family environment." Derek interrupted in a rough voice. "But he's my family." Natalie's expression softened, though her resolve remained. "He's a fox, Derek. No matter how much you love him, you can't change what he is." The drive home was interminable. Derek's grip on the steering wheel never loosened as images of those wild, skittish foxes haunted his mind. He pictured Copper confused and alone, wondering why its family had abandoned it, and his heart ached at the thought. That night, his house was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Sitting in his favorite armchair, Derek watched Copper sleeping soundly. A tiny fox curled in a perfect circle, tail snugly wrapped around its body, chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Suddenly, a scratching noise shattered the quiet. Derek blinked and focused on Copper, now awake and pawing at the back door with urgency. Its movements were frantic, and it let out a series of sharp, high-pitched yips, its claws scraping the wood. "Copper, what's wrong?" Derek asked as he approached slowly. The fox's agitation grew. It paced back and forth, chirping in a tone that spoke of a wild, urgent call. After a brief hesitation, Derek reached for the door handle. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to Copper. The door swung open, revealing the cool night air. For several heartbeats, Copper froze in the doorway, every muscle tense, then, like a shot, it bolted into the darkness. Derek's heart lurched as he grabbed his flashlight and sprinted outside. His bare feet pounded on the damp grass as the beam of light cut through the night. "Copper, come back," he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet streets. But only the whisper of leaves in the breeze answered him. He searched frantically behind bushes, under porches, in every shadow the light reached, but there was no sign of the striking red fur or the bright eyes he so desperately sought. As time crawled by, his voice grew hoarse and his legs ached from the relentless search. Finally, as midnight yielded to early dawn, a defeated Derek trudged back home, shoulders slumped in despair. The house felt emptier than ever, and sleep was impossible. He left the back porch light burning and collapsed into his armchair, eyes red and fixed on the door. Just before dawn, as the sky shifted from deep black to a dusky blue, Derek heard a faint scratching at the back door. His heart leaped as he rushed to open it. There, standing in the soft glow of early light, was Copper, its fur damp with morning dew, and its bright eyes locked onto Derek's face with something new, mysterious, and unreadable. Silently, Copper padded inside, leaving tiny wet paw prints along the floor. Derek exhaled shakily in relief as he closed the door behind them. Later that morning, as Derek sat at his desk, an unread email caught his eye. The subject read, DNA test results, sample number 2847. His hand trembled as he hovered over the message, then clicked. Copper lay sprawled in a sunlit patch nearby, its red fur almost glowing. Taking a deep breath, Derek read the results, which displayed charts and percentages that confirmed what his heart had suspected. Copper was 100% Vulpes vulpes, a genuine red fox, not a dog or part canine, but a true wild fox. Derek pushed away from his desk, running his hands through his hair as the room suddenly felt oppressive. He glanced at Copper, who yawned and stretched, utterly unaware of the gravity of the moment. "A fox," he whispered. "You're really a fox." The word felt strange on his tongue, as if he were speaking in an alien language. With trembling fingers, Derek began searching for information on fox ownership. Each new tab revealed grimmer news, strict laws, severe fines, jail time, and worst of all, the immediate confiscation of any wild animal kept as a pet. His throat constricted as he read about previous cases in which wildlife authorities had seized exotic animals, sometimes relocating them to sanctuaries or, in the worst cases, euthanizing them when they were deemed too domesticated to survive on their own. In the midst of his research, the soft sound of padded footsteps caught his attention. Copper had returned to its usual spot by the couch, curled tightly into a ball, tail wrapped around its body, and its eyes, though calm, held that unmistakable, intense gaze. In that moment, everything made sense. The chirping instead of barking, the cat-like grace in its movements, its aversion to other dogs, and its nocturnal activity. All the quirks that had once seemed odd and endearing were, in fact, inherent fox behaviors. Derek realized that he had been so focused on the idea of rescuing a helpless puppy that he had overlooked the animal's wild essence, a creature meant to live free in the forest among its own kind. Copper chirped softly, a sound that now resonated with both familiarity and sorrow, reminding Derek of that rainy night when he had first rescued the tiny, shivering animal. The thought of someday losing Copper, of being forced to surrender it to authorities, filled him with a deep, unbearable ache. He knew his time with Copper was running out. Soon, he would have to face a decision that would irrevocably alter both their lives. During a break at the fire station the next day, Derek hunched over his phone, scrolling through endless pages of exotic pet regulations. His coffee had long since grown cold beside him. Every so often, he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of mounting frustration. The laws were clear. No foxes were allowed as pets, without exception. Yet Derek could not imagine a life without Copper, not after everything they'd shared. In a desperate bid, he dialed yet another number, this time contacting a wildlife sanctuary in the adjacent state. The conversation unfolded in the same familiar pattern. "I understand your attachment," the sanctuary director explained kindly, "but foxes aren't meant to be kept as pets. Our facilities are excellent here." Before the director could continue, Derek ended the call. He had already reached out to 6 agencies that morning, consulted 3 legal experts, and spoken with 2 rehabilitation centers, and every answer was the same. Copper had to be turned over. That morning, as Derek finished his calls, Jamal appeared in the break room once more. Spinning a chair around to face him, arms crossed, Jamal said, "You look like you're about ready to toss that phone through a wall." Derek let out a heavy sigh. I've tried everything. No one will let me keep him. After a long pause, Jamal ventured. What about a special permit? I knew a guy who kept a rescued hawk that couldn't be released. They granted him permission to keep it for educational purposes. Derek's eyes lit up with hope for the first time that day. Special permits for animals that can't be released, he repeated. If I can prove that Copper wouldn't survive in the wild. Without delay, Derek began pulling up his photo gallery, scrolling through videos of Copper's strange behavior. Attempts to sleep in the dryer, mischievously stealing socks, chirping at the television. He had dozens of clips that showcased just how domesticated Copper had become. Jamal, you're brilliant, he said, already drafting an email to Dr. Reyes requesting a formal statement about Copper's level of tameness. For the next hour, he gathered evidence. Videos of Copper's futile hunts for even the slowest insects, photos of how it stashed its food in hidden nooks, and statements from fellow firefighters about Copper's odd antics at the station. That same evening, as Derek sat on his living room floor, watching Copper stalk a moth that had crept into the house, he marveled at the fox's graceful, predatory movements, a vivid reminder of its wild heritage. Yet when the moth eventually escaped through an open window, Copper simply trotted back to him, curling up contentedly against his leg with a soft chirp. Derek reached down, scratching behind Copper's ears, and whispered, "You belong here with me. We just have to prove it to them." All he needed now was to convince the authorities that keeping his unusual companion was not only justified but safe. In the crisp light of the next morning, Derek led Copper along their customary walking route. The fox trotted faithfully beside him, its vibrant red coat gleaming in the early sunlight. Yet something felt amiss that day. As they passed, a neighbor, Mrs. Park from next door, was tending her flowers with her usual friendly wave conspicuously missing. Instead, she fixed a narrowed-eyed stare on Copper. Alarmed, Derek quickened his pace, tugging gently on the leash. A nearby jogger even slowed to do a double take. "What kind of dog is that?" the jogger asked, brows furrowed. "Oh, it's just a rescue," Derek mumbled, already turning back toward home. Later, back at the fire station, Jamal pulled Derek aside near the equipment lockers. His normally upbeat expression had turned somber. "People are talking, man," he said quietly. "Mrs. Park mentioned she'd seen you with that fox, and even Carlos made a crack about calling animal control." Derek's heart sank as he gripped the locker's edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If someone reports Copper before I get that special permit, they'll take him away," he whispered more to himself than to Jamal. "No questions asked." Jamal nodded grimly. "Maybe you should keep a low profile for a while." That evening, as Derek paced his living room watching Copper by the window, the fox stood with its front paws on the sill, ears pricked and nose twitching in the cool air. Derek made a decision. "No more walks. No more visits to the station until I get that permit," he declared firmly. Copper immediately sensed the shift, moving from window to window with soft, questioning chirps, and even began scratching at the door, looking back at him with puzzled eyes. Derek's heart ached at the sight, knowing that though it wasn't fair to either of them, he couldn't risk losing Copper now. As night fell, he double-checked every window and door, while Copper paced behind him, still restless and longing for the outside world. "Just for now, little buddy," Derek whispered as he locked up and headed off to bed. A few days later, Derek's truck rumbled into the sprawling grounds of a wildlife sanctuary, a vast natural habitat punctuated by various enclosures. The gravel crunched under his tires as he parked, his knuckles still white from the earlier tension. He had left Copper at home, unable to face the thought of bringing him to such an unfamiliar place. Not yet. Outside, the cool morning air was filled with the sounds of wildlife. Following the signs, Derek made his way to the main office where he met Natalie Brooks, a seasoned, kind-eyed woman whose weathered features spoke of countless rescued animals. "Welcome to Wild Haven," she said, extending a hand. "I understand you have questions about our fox rehabilitation program." Derek nodded and followed her along a winding pathway as she explained their process, how they evaluated each animal, determined its capacity to return to the wild, and provided lifelong care for those too imprinted on humans. They reached a large, naturally landscaped enclosure complete with logs, brush piles, and small dens. Derek's heart sank as he observed the resident foxes. They scattered at the slightest human approach, disappearing into the undergrowth or watching warily from a distance. "These are genuine wild foxes," Natalie explained softly. "This is how they naturally behave." Derek couldn't help but compare them to Copper. The way it curled up on his couch, chirped for attention, and followed him around the house was so different. "Here, we offer excellent care," Natalie continued, her tone gentle yet firm. "There's ample space, proper nutrition, and round-the-clock veterinary support, but no family environment." Derek's voice grew rough as he interjected, "But he's my family." Natalie sighed sympathetically. "He's a fox, Derek. No matter how deep your love is, you can't change his nature." The drive home felt interminable, with Derek's mind replaying images of those elusive, wild foxes. He pictured Copper, confused and alone, wondering why its natural family had been abandoned. His heart ached at the thought. That night, as silence reigned and only the low hum of the heater filled the house, Derek sat in his armchair watching Copper sleep. A tiny fox curled in a perfect circle, its tail snugly wrapped around its body, chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Suddenly, a sharp scratching noise broke the silence. Derek blinked, focusing on Copper, who was now awake and frantically pawing at the back door. Its movements were desperate, and a series of high-pitched yips erupted from its throat, the sound of its claws scraping against the wood. "Copper, what's the matter?" Derek asked, slowly approaching. The fox's agitation mounted. It paced anxiously back and forth, chirping in a tone that conveyed a wild urgency. After a moment's pause, Derek reached for the door handle. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to the fox. "Let's see what it is." The door swung open, and a cool gust of night air flooded in. For several long heartbeats, Copper stood frozen in the doorway, every muscle taut. Then, in a sudden burst, it bolted into the darkness. Derek's heart pounded as he snatched his flashlight and dashed outside. His bare feet slapped against the damp grass as he swept the beam across the yard. "Copper, come back!" he shouted into the empty night, but only the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze responded. Frantically, he combed through every shadow, behind bushes and under porches, the beam of his light slicing through the darkness. Yet there was no sign of the vivid red coat or those brilliant eyes. As the hours dragged on, his voice became hoarse and his legs burned from the exhaustive search. Finally, as midnight gave way to the early morning, a defeated Derek trudged back home, his shoulders heavy with sorrow. The house felt emptier than ever, and sleep eluded him. He left the back porch light on and collapsed into his armchair, staring at the door with red-rimmed eyes. Just as the sky began to lighten from inky black to a deep blue before dawn, Derek heard a soft scratching at the back door. His heart leaped as he hurried to open it. There, bathed in the gentle glow of early light, stood Copper, its fur damp with dew, and its bright eyes fixed on Derek with an expression that was at once mysterious and knowing. In silence, Copper padded inside, leaving behind tiny, wet paw prints on the floor. Derek exhaled shakily in relief as he closed the door behind them. Later that morning, Derek sat at his desk and stared at an unread email with the subject DNA test results, sample number 2847. His hand trembled as he hovered over it, and then, summoning his courage, he clicked to open the message. Copper lay nearby in a sunlit patch, its red fur gleaming softly. The email loaded, revealing charts and percentages that confirmed what his heart already suspected. Copper was unequivocally 100% Vulpes vulpes, a red fox. Not a dog, not even partly canine, but a genuine wild fox. Derek pushed back from his desk, running his fingers through his hair as the room seemed to close in around him. He glanced at Copper, who yawned and stretched, entirely oblivious to the weight of the revelation. "A fox," he whispered. "You're really a fox." The words felt alien, as if spoken in a language he scarcely understood. With a shaking hand, Derek began searching online for every scrap of information regarding fox ownership. Each new tab he opened delivered bleaker news. strict legal prohibitions, staggering fines, possible jail time, and most importantly, the certainty of immediate confiscation by wildlife authorities. His throat tightened as he read case after case where wild animals had been seized, taken away from loving homes, and either relocated to sanctuaries or, in some instances, euthanized because they were too domesticated to survive on their own. The soft sound of footsteps on the carpet caught his attention once again. Copper had moved to its usual spot by the couch, curled up in a tight ball with its tail wrapped around itself, its bright eyes still fixed intently on Derek. In that quiet moment, every piece of evidence, the chirping instead of barking, the graceful, cat-like movements, the avoidance of other dogs, and its nocturnal habits, suddenly made sense. They were not quirks at all, but intrinsic fox behaviors. Derek realized that he had been so enamored with the idea of saving a helpless puppy that he had blinded himself to the reality. This was a wild animal, a fox, that belonged in the forest, not in a suburban home. A soft, familiar chirp escaped Copper, the same delicate sound that had first captured Derek's heart on that stormy night. The thought of never hearing that sound again made Derek's chest tighten. He knew that, eventually, he might be forced to let go of Copper. The idea of someone else taking his unusual companion away filled him with dread. During a break at the fire station the following day, Derek hunched over his phone once again, scrolling through endless legal documents and regulations regarding exotic pet ownership. His coffee sat untouched and cold by his side. Every few minutes, he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of deep frustration. The laws were unyielding. Foxes simply could not be kept as pets. Yet there had to be a loophole. He couldn't lose Copper after everything they'd shared. In a moment of desperation, he dialed yet another number, this time contacting a wildlife sanctuary in a neighboring state. The conversation unfolded in the same monotonous pattern. "I understand your attachment," the sanctuary director explained gently, "but foxes aren't built to be pets. Our facilities are top-notch." Before she could finish, Derek ended the call. He had already reached out to 6 different agencies that morning, consulted 3 legal advisors, and spoken with 2 rehabilitation centers. And every single answer was the same. Copper must be relinquished. That same morning, as Derek wrapped up his last call, Jamal strolled into the break room. Spinning a chair around to face him, arms folded, Jamal remarked, "You look like you're about to toss that phone out the window." Derek let out a heavy sigh. "I've tried everything, and no one is willing to help me keep him." Jamal paused before suggesting, "What about a special permit? I knew a guy who kept a rescued hawk because it couldn't be returned to the wild. They allowed him to keep it for educational purposes." Derek's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. "Special permits for animals that are non-releasable? If I can prove that Copper wouldn't survive in the wild." Without wasting a second, Derek began pulling up his photo gallery and reviewing videos of Copper's bizarre behavior. Clips of the fox trying to sleep in a dryer, stealthily pilfering socks, chirping at the television. He had amassed dozens of recordings that clearly showed how domesticated Copper had become. "Jamal, you're brilliant," he exclaimed, already composing an email to Dr. Reyes asking for a formal statement regarding Copper's unusual level of tameness. For the next hour, he gathered evidence, videos of Copper's failed attempts at hunting even the slowest moving insects, photos that captured its habit of hiding food in secret spots, and statements from his fellow firefighters about Copper's odd behavior at the station. That evening, as Derek sat on the living room floor watching Copper stalk a stray moth that had found its way into the house, he marveled at the fox's graceful, predatory movements, a stark reminder of its wild ancestry. Yet when the moth finally fluttered away through an open window, Copper merely trotted back to him, curling up contentedly against his leg with a gentle, approving chirp. Derek reached down to scratch behind Copper's ears, feeling the soft, luxurious fur beneath his fingers, and whispered, "You belong here with me. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." All that remained was to persuade the authorities that his unusual companion was not only safe but meant to be by his side. The next morning, as Derek led Copper along their familiar route, the fox trotted steadily beside him, its red coat catching the early rays of the sun. However, something fell off that day. As they passed by, Mrs. Kim, who lived next door, stood by her garden, her customary warm smile replaced by a narrowed, critical stare directed at Copper. Alarmed, Derek quickened his steps and gently tugged on the leash. A nearby jogger even slowed for a double take. "What kind of dog is that?" the jogger asked, his brow furrowed. "Oh, it's just a rescue," Derek mumbled, already turning back toward home. Later at the fire station, Jamal pulled Derek aside near the equipment lockers. His usually upbeat expression was now somber. "People are talking, man," he confided quietly. "Mrs. Kim mentioned seeing you with that fox, and even Carlos made a crack about calling animal control." Derek's stomach sank as he gripped the locker's edge until his knuckles went white. "If someone reports Copper before I get that permit, they'll take him away," he murmured, more to himself than to Jamal. "No ifs, ands, or buts." Jamal nodded gravely. "Maybe you should keep a low profile for a while." That evening, as Derek paced his living room watching Copper from the window, the fox stood alert with its front paws on the sill, ears pricked and nose twitching in the cool night air. Derek made his decision. "No more walks. No more visits to the station until I get that permit," he declared firmly. Copper immediately sensed the change, shifting from window to window with soft, questioning chirps and even scratching at the door, glancing back with puzzled eyes. Derek's heart ached as he watched his friend's confusion. Though it wasn't fair, he couldn't risk losing Copper. As night fell, he double-checked all the windows and doors, while Copper paced behind him, restless and yearning to be outside. "Just for now, buddy," Derek whispered, securing the deadbolt and heading off to bed. A few days later, Derek's truck rumbled onto the grounds of a sprawling wildlife sanctuary, a vast, natural habitat dotted with enclosures. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he parked, his hands still trembling on the wheel. He had left Copper at home, unable to bear the thought of subjecting him to such an unfamiliar environment. Not yet. Outside, the morning air was cool and filled with the sounds of nature. Derek followed the signs to the main office, where he met Ava Lynn, a seasoned wildlife rehabilitator with kind, thoughtful eyes and a gentle smile. "Welcome to Wild Haven," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you have questions about our fox rehabilitation process." Derek nodded and trailed behind her along a winding path as she explained their methods, how they evaluated each animal, determined whether it could return to the wild, and provided lifelong care for those too imprinted on humans to survive on their own. They soon arrived at a large fenced enclosure that mimicked a natural environment with logs, brush piles, and small dens scattered about. Derek's heart sank as he watched the resident foxes, alert and skittish, darting away at the slightest hint of human presence or watching warily from a distance. "These are authentic wild foxes," Ava explained softly. "This is their true nature." Derek thought of Copper, the way it had curled up on his couch, chirped for attention, and trailed him from room to room. And D couldn't help but feel that his companion was different. "Here, we provide outstanding care," Ava continued, her voice both gentle and firm. "There's ample space, proper nutrition, and continuous veterinary support, but no family atmosphere." Derek's voice grew rough as he interjected, "But he's my family." Ava offered a sympathetic look. "He's a fox, Derek. No matter how much you care for him, you can't change his essence." The drive home felt interminable as Derek's mind replayed images of those wild, elusive foxes. He pictured Copper, confused, isolated, and longing for the wild, and his heart ached at the thought. That night, in the near silence of his home with only the soft hum of the heater as company, Derek sat in his armchair, watching Copper sleep. A little fox curled in a perfect circle, its tail wrapped snugly around its body, chest rising and falling steadily. Suddenly, a scratching sound shattered the quiet. Derek blinked, focusing on Copper, who was now awake and frantically pawing at the back door. Its movements were desperate, and it let out a series of sharp, high-pitched yips as its claws scraped against the wood. "Copper, what's wrong?" Derek asked, slowly approaching. The fox's agitation escalated. It paced back and forth, chirping in a tone filled with a wild urgency that Derek couldn't ignore. After a brief pause, he reached for the door handle. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to Copper. "Let's see what it is." The door swung open, releasing a cool gust of night air. For several long heartbeats, Copper stood frozen in the doorway, every muscle tense. Then in a sudden burst it bolted into the darkness. Derek's heart pounded as he grabbed his flashlight and rushed outside. His bare feet pounded on the damp grass as he swept the beam of light across the yard. "Copper, come back!" he shouted into the still night, but only the rustling of leaves and a gentle breeze answered. Frantically, he scoured behind bushes, under porches, and in every dark corner the light reached, yet there was no sign of the vivid red fur or those striking eyes. As time stretched on, his voice grew hoarse and his legs burned from the relentless search. Finally, as midnight melted into early dawn, a defeated Derek trudged back home, shoulders slumped in despair. The house felt emptier than ever, and sleep was nowhere to be found. He left the back porch light on and collapsed into his armchair, staring at the door with tearful, red-rimmed eyes. Just as the sky began to lighten from pitch black to a deep, inky blue, Derek heard a faint scratching at the back door. His heart leaped as he rushed to open it. There, in the soft pre-dawn light, stood Copper, its fur slightly damp with dew, its bright eyes fixed on Derek with an expression both mysterious and knowing. In silence, Copper padded inside, leaving delicate, wet paw prints on the floor. Derek exhaled shakily in relief as he closed the door behind them. Later that morning, as Derek sat at his desk, he noticed an unread email with the subject DNA test results, sample number 2847. His hand trembled as he hovered over it. Then, summoning his courage, he clicked to open the message. Copper lay nearby, sprawled in a sunlit patch with its red fur aglow. The email loaded, displaying charts and percentages that confirmed what his heart had long suspected. Copper was unequivocally 100% Vulpes vulpes, a genuine red fox. Not a dog, not even partially canine, but a true wild fox. Derek pushed himself back from the desk, running his fingers through his hair as the room seemed to close in around him. He glanced at Copper, who yawned and stretched, completely unaware of the monumental truth. "A fox," he whispered. "You're really a fox." The word felt strange, foreign, as if spoken in another language. With shaking hands, Derek began scouring the web for any information on keeping a fox as a pet. Each new page revealed even grimmer news: strict laws, harsh fines, potential jail time, and, most alarmingly, the immediate confiscation of any wild animal kept in a home. His throat tightened as he read accounts of wildlife authorities seizing exotic pets, relocating them to sanctuaries, or even euthanizing them when they were too domesticated to survive in the wild. Then, the soft sound of padded footsteps drew his attention again. Copper had moved to its usual spot by the couch, curled tightly, tail wrapped around itself, its eyes fixed intently on Derek as always. In that quiet moment, every detail, the chirping instead of barking, the cat-like movements, the avoidance of other canines, the nocturnal habits, clicked into place. They weren't odd quirks at all. They were natural fox behaviors. Derek realized he had been so enchanted by the idea of saving a helpless puppy that he had overlooked the wild truth. Copper was meant to live free in the forest with its own kind. A soft chirp, the very same that had first won his heart on that stormy night, escaped Copper once more. The sound now carried with it both familiarity and melancholy, a reminder of what might soon be lost if the authorities intervened. Derek slumped in his chair, overwhelmed by the reality that he could not keep Copper, at least not legally. The thought of someone coming to take his beloved fox away made his stomach churn. That afternoon at the fire station, during a brief respite, Derek found himself hunched over his phone once again, scrolling through endless pages of legal jargon about exotic pet ownership. His coffee had long turned cold beside him. Every so often, he ran his hand through his hair in mounting frustration. The laws were as clear as ever. No foxes were permitted as pets. Yet he couldn't imagine life without Copper, not after all they'd shared. In a final act of desperation, he dialed another number, this time contacting a wildlife sanctuary in a neighboring state. The conversation, as expected, followed the same pattern. "I understand your attachment," the sanctuary director said kindly, but foxes aren't meant to be kept as pets. Our facilities are excellent here." Before she could elaborate, Derek ended the call. He had already spoken with 6 different agencies that morning, 3 legal consultants, and 2 rehabilitation centers. And every answer was identical. Copper must go. That same morning, as Derek wrapped up his final call, Jamal reappeared in the break room. Spinning a chair around to face him, arms crossed over the backrest, Jamal teased, "You look like you're about to toss that phone through the wall." Derek exhaled a heavy sigh. "I've tried everything. No one is willing to help me keep him." Jamal fell silent for a moment before adding, "What about special permits? I once knew a guy who kept a rescued hawk because it couldn't be released. They allowed him to keep it for educational purposes." Derek's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Special permits for non-releasable animals? If I can prove that Copper cannot survive in the wild." Without further delay, Derek began pulling up his photo gallery, scrolling through videos of Copper's peculiar behavior. Videos of the fox trying to nap in a dryer, stealing socks, chirping at the television. He had compiled dozens of clips showing just how domesticated Copper had become. "Jamal, you're a genius," he said, already drafting an email to Dr. Reyes requesting a formal statement about Copper's level of domestication. For the next hour, he gathered all the evidence. Videos of Copper's failed attempts at hunting even the slowest insects, photos showing its habit of hiding food, and testimonials from his fellow firefighters about Copper's behavior at the station. That evening, as Derek sat on his living room floor watching Copper stalk a moth that had wandered inside, he marveled at the fox's graceful, predatory movements, a vivid reminder of its wild origins. Yet when the moth finally escaped through an open window, Copper simply trotted back to him, curling up against his leg with a contented chirp. Derek reached down and scratched behind Copper's ears, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingertips, and murmured, "You belong here with me, Copper. I just have to convince them of that." In the early morning light that followed, Derek led Copper along their usual route. The fox trotted loyally beside him, its red coat shimmering in the sunrise. But as they passed by, something was different. Mrs. Rivera from next door was outside watering her plants, but her customary warm wave was missing. Instead, she glared at Copper with narrowed eyes. Alarmed, Derek quickened his pace and tugged gently on the leash. A nearby jogger slowed to a double take. "What kind of dog is that?" the jogger asked, brows furrowed. "Oh, it's just a rescue," Derek mumbled, already turning back toward home. Later that morning at the fire station, Jamal pulled Derek aside near the equipment lockers. His normally cheerful face was now etched with concern. "People are talking, man," he said quietly. "Mrs. Rivera mentioned seeing you with that fox, and even Carlos joked about calling animal control." Derek's stomach churned as he gripped the locker's edge until his knuckles were white. "If someone reports Copper before I secure that special permit, they'll take him away," he muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. "No ifs, ands, or buts." Jamal nodded grimly. "Maybe you should lay low for a while." That evening, as Derek paced his living room watching Copper near the window, the fox stood with its front paws on the sill, ears pricked and nose twitching in the cool night air. Derek made his decision. "No more walks. No more station visits until I get that permit," he declared firmly. Copper immediately sensed the change, shifting from window to window with soft, almost questioning chirps, and even began scratching at the door, glancing back at him with puzzled eyes. Derek's heart ached as he watched his friend's confusion. Though it wasn't fair to either of them, he couldn't risk losing Copper. As darkness fell, he double-checked every window and door before heading to bed. A few days later, Derek's truck rumbled into the expansive parking lot of the Wildlife Protection Office. With a thick folder of documents clutched under his arm, he stepped inside and was directed to Dr. Elaine Murphy's office, a stern-faced woman surrounded by conservation pamphlets and wildlife photographs. "I've reviewed your initial application, Mr. Carter," she said professionally, gesturing for him to take a seat. "You understand that what you're asking is highly unusual." Derek nodded, opening his folder. "I know it's not ideal, but Copper's situation is unique. I've gathered everything to show why." Before he could finish, Dr. Murphy held up a hand. "Foxes belong in the wild, not in someone's home. Allowing exceptions sets a dangerous precedent. Derek's voice trembled as he countered, but he's not just some wild animal, he's family. Dr. Murphy's expression softened slightly. I understand this is difficult, but legally I must say, he is a fox. Derek's heart sank. What can I do? He asked hoarsely. There are wildlife sanctuaries, she suggested gently. Places equipped to care for foxes. I can make some calls. He's not just some animal. He's family, Derek insisted. Dr. Murphy nodded sympathetically. I know it's hard. Let me give you the contact for a wildlife rehabilitator I work with. That afternoon, Derek sat across from Ava Lynn, a veteran wildlife rehabilitator, whose office walls were adorned with photos of rescued animals. She listened intently as Derek recounted Kappa's story, nodding occasionally. The problem, Ava explained, leaning forward, is that Kappa was rescued at such a young age that he became completely imprinted on you. He never learned how to be a wild fox, so if he's returned to a sanctuary, he'd have to learn everything from scratch. Her expression grew serious. It's not that simple. Adult foxes that are this domesticated rarely adjust well to sanctuary life. They struggle to interact with their own kind, become stressed or depressed, and some never adapt at all. Derek felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. So, what's the alternative? He asked. There isn't a good one, Ava admitted softly. He can't legally stay with you, but he's also not equipped to live in the wild or even in a sanctuary. He's caught between two worlds. The drive home was silent as Derek's mind raced with bleak possibilities. That evening, he sat on his couch, watching Copper sleep in its favorite spot by the window. The little fox's chest rose and fell peacefully, utterly unaware of the impossible decision looming over them both. Kappa's ear twitched in its sleep, and it emitted a soft chirp, the same gentle note that had first captured Derek's heart on that rainy night. The thought of never hearing that sound again made Derek's heart ache. He knew that soon he would have to make a decision that would change their lives forever. Though for now, he simply savored the moment, trying to commit every detail to memory. The following day, during his break at the fire station, Derek hunched over his phone, scrolling through page after page of exotic pet regulations. His coffee, long since cold, sat abandoned beside him. Every few minutes, he ran his hand through his hair in growing frustration. The laws were explicit. No foxes were permitted as pets, but there had to be a workaround. He couldn't lose Copper, not after everything they'd been through. In desperation, he dialed another number, reaching out to a wildlife sanctuary in a neighboring state. The conversation, as before, was discouraging. I understand your attachment, the director said kindly, but foxes aren't meant to be kept in homes. Our facilities are here to care for them. Derek ended the call before she could finish. He had already contacted 6 agencies, 3 legal consultants, and 2 rehabilitation centers that morning. And the answer was always the same. Copper had to be given up. Later that morning, as Derek finished his final call, Jamal appeared again in the break room. Spinning around in his chair with arms crossed, Jamal said, "You look like you're about ready to throw that phone through a wall." Derek sighed heavily. "I've tried everything, Jamal. No one is willing to help me keep him." Jamal fell silent for a moment, then added, "What about a special permit? I once knew a guy who kept a rescued hawk because it couldn't be released back into the wild. They allowed him to keep it for educational purposes." Derek's eyes lit up with hope. "Special permits for animals that can't survive in the wild," he repeated. "If I can prove Copper isn't capable of surviving out there," without delay, he began pulling up his photo gallery, reviewing videos of Kappa's strange behavior. Videos of the fox attempting to sleep in the dryer, stealing socks, chirping at the TV. He had dozens of clips that demonstrated just how domesticated Copper had become. "Jamal, you're a genius," he said, already drafting an email to Dr. Reyes to request a formal statement about Kappa's domestication level. For the next hour, he meticulously gathered evidence. Videos of Kappa's failed hunts, photos of hidden kibble stashes, and statements from his fellow firefighters about Kappa's unusual antics at the station. That evening, as Derek sat on the living room floor watching Copper stalk a moth that had wandered into the house, he marveled at the fox's fluid, predatory movements, a reminder of its wild heritage. Yet when the moth escaped through an open window, Copper simply trotted back to him, curling up against his leg with a content, soft chirp. Derek reached down to scratch behind Copper's ears, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingertips, and whispered, "You belong here with me. I'll fight for you." As the autumn evening deepened and the sky glowed with shades of amber and gold, Derek sat on his back porch, reflecting on the incredible journey they had shared. It had been almost 1 year since that stormy night when he first found Copper, trembling and abandoned. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Copper dozed beside him, its red fur catching the last rays of sunlight. No longer the trembling kit he'd mistaken for a puppy, Copper had grown into a creature of wild beauty, its coat thick and luxurious, its movements graceful and sure. The special permit tag dangled from its collar, a small symbol of their hard-won right to be together. Derek smiled, remembering every step of their journey. The DNA test that had changed everything, the long fight to keep Copper, and the unexpected foray into search and rescue work. Just last week, Copper had even helped locate a lost hiker by tracking a faint scent through treacherous terrain, a feat that had even stumped the police dogs at times. The fire station had become Copper's second home, and even Sparky the Dalmatian had grown to accept the unusual presence of a fox among them. The crew now kept special treats in the break room, though Copper still managed to sneak a few for itself whenever possible. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Derek reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. Before Copper, his days had been consumed solely by work, his home empty and silent. Now, there was always movement, always life, whether in Copper's playful chirps or its quiet, watchful presence. The fox stirred beside him, stretching its lean body before settling closer to Derek's side. Its outdoor enclosure stood nearby as a testament to their compromise between wild and tame. Yet Copper rarely used it for more than play, often preferring the comfort of indoor living, curling up on its favorite spot on the couch or at the foot of Derek's bed. Night after night, as stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Derek would watch Copper's ears perk up at the rustling of leaves, always alert to the nocturnal symphony of the forest beyond their yard. He sometimes wondered if Copper ever longed for that other life, the wild existence it might have had if fate hadn't intervened on that stormy night. The glimmer in Copper's eyes as it watched the forest, the subtle shift in its posture, suggested that the call of the wild still stirred within. Yet, just as quickly as the thought arose, Copper would nudge its head against Derek's arm in a gesture that was neither entirely wild nor completely tame, but uniquely its own. Smiling softly, Derek thought, "You're free to go if you choose, but you've decided to stay with me." And so it was, night after night, Copper remained, choosing the life they had built together. If you enjoyed this tale of Derek and Copper, then I've selected another story just as compelling for you to experience next. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.